It's in you. What you are meant to be is already within you. That is, the potential is there. And it has been your entire life, from the very beginning. Sort of like this pine tree. This is one that I had left over last year as I was planting pines on our place. And I saved this one in a pot along with 3 others. This little tree, even if it had a mind, could not imagine what its future is. But I already know where I'm going to plant it. And I already know why I'm going to plant it there. And I already know what I want it to become. And guess what? There's one other thing I already know. This tree is going to undergo some radical surgery. I'll put it that way. Because if you'll notice, it's really not one tree, but 2 forks right down under the surface. And I know that that means there's something here that will hinder the process. You know that a tree of any kind that is split in 2 directions will eventually split and fall. What's going to have to happen is one of these 2 trunks is going to have to be cut off. And in the same way, you and I have limbs in our lives that are simply going to have to be pruned away. Because if we don't cooperate with God in pruning away things that don't need to be there, it'll limit our growth, it'll hurt our potential, it can cause us to have a great fall later on. And the God who put you here, the God who planted you where you are, will do whatever it takes to get you there, to make you what He set out for you to be. That does not mean that it's destined to happen. That does not mean that you don't have a choice in it. You see, the Bible is filled with stories of men and women who started out like this pine tree. God put the potential in them that He was going to use to do good things in the world. Some of those men and women were very, very sensitive to God's leadership. They obeyed Him to the best of their ability, and there were times they got it wrong. There were times they made the wrong decision. Other times they just plain sinned. But because they were so committed to discovering and living out the will of God in their life, it happened. He's not looking for somebody perfect. He's looking for somebody flexible. He's looking for somebody who will cooperate rather than resist. Abraham, Moses, they cooperated with the process. And they made an even bigger, far bigger impact on the world than Crazy Horse. But there were other people in the Bible who had just as much or more abilities who really accomplished nothing. Samson was one of my first heroes as a kid. My goodness, he's the biblical Superman. He really is. He was a superhero. Strength that nobody could even measure. And the reason the Bible says he was given that strength is that he was going to begin to deliver his people from their oppressors, those who were enslaving them. Only it didn't happen because Samson didn't cooperate. Samson allowed his great strength to develop into a great, big, proud ego. And he thought that he went his way, that he didn't need God anymore, and he wound up with a mighty sad ending. I don't tell you that trying to scare you. No. I'm telling you this because whether or not you surrender and cooperate with God's work in your life, whether or not you surrender and cooperate, is the thing that will determine, in the end, whether your life is a success or failure. Whether your life was well spent or whether it was wasted. But everything you need to live that life well is in you. God has already put it there. God put it in a man named Peter. And we read about Peter early in his life when we open the Bible to the book of John, chapter 1. Jesus was walking along the seaside, through the streets, looking for disciples to follow. Men who were going to change the world. Men whose names were going to be talked about for ages. And he came upon this young man named Peter. John chapter 1, verse 42. Then Andrew brought Simon to meet Jesus. Looking intently at Simon, Jesus said, "Your name is Simon, son of John, but you will be called Cephas," which means Peter. The brave's name was Curly. He discovered that he was more than Curly. He was Crazy Horse. Peter knew his name was Simon. That's all he'd ever been until he met Jesus Christ, who said, "Your name is Simon, all right, but there's more to you than you realize. You are a rock. You are a rock. And through you, and your faith, and your work, I'm going to build my church. On your own, you're called Peter, the rock." You see, God has a way of looking into each of us and seeing good things that nobody else even knows are there. He often does look into your life or mine, and he sees good potential that we don't even know is there. And that's why one of the things we must understand if we want to do God's will for our life is this. God's will is not something we create. It's not something we write up or come up with. It's something we discover. Because it's already built into us. The potential, the purpose of that tree is already built in. We have to discover what we are. Peter was told by Jesus, "You're the rock." And he went on to say, "I'm going to build my church on you." Pretty important stuff. And Peter, therefore, did just what I'd have done. He started getting sort of arrogant about that. I mean, it's not just everybody who hears those kind of words from Jesus. "You're so important. I think so highly of you that I'm going to build my church around your work." It went to his head. And he thought he was a lot stronger than he really was. He thought he had more commitment that he really had. Do you know what? Very few of us have an accurate understanding of ourselves. Because some of us, like Peter, think we are much better than we actually are. And that's easy enough for God to deal with. I'll tell you how in a minute. But it's just as bad, and perhaps even more common, to find a person who thinks too little of themselves. There's no arrogance in them, but there's a lot of unbelief. Because you can talk to them about their potential, the good that you see them doing, and how you can see it growing even bigger, and they're going to, oh no, not me, that's me. You see people who cannot accept a compliment. It's not a virtue to be unable to accept a compliment. If it's true, say thank you. We have to think realistically of ourselves. Not too much, not too little. Peter thought too much. When that happens, it's inevitable. God is going to have to do something to bring that down to earth, to bring us down to earth. He's going to have to allow circumstances to unfold in such a way that we have some sort of fall, some sort of setback or embarrassment, heartache, whatever it takes. It will come eventually. Because just like this tree is going to have to be pruned and have almost half of its entire body cut off in order to grow tall and strong, so it is with us. Some things have got to be cut off. Some things have got to go. Some things just cannot. There are some things we cannot take with us on the journey we're going on. Jesus said, narrow is the way. Narrow is the gate. And that has a whole lot of meanings, but one of them is, if it's a narrow way, you can't carry a whole lot of baggage with you. There's a lot of things that just are going to have to be left behind. And those are things that need to be left behind. Now, I'm going to share a personal testimony with you about this, how this has worked in my life. It's one I wanted to share with you for a whole year, but I knew the time was not right. A wise preacher once said to another group of preachers, if you're going to tell your personal testimonies, make sure you preach from your scars, not from your wounds. See, if I preach from a wound, while I'm still hurting, while I'm not even healed up myself, I'm still not well. First of all, I'm not going to do a very good job of giving my testimony, and I'm not going to have much excitement or much, it's not going to inspire anybody because I haven't even yet achieved victory. Don't preach, or don't, when you're sharing with other people your stories, don't testify from your wounds. Things that are still hurting, testify from your scars. The things that have healed, those are the things that you are ready to share. And here's what I want to share with you. It ties right in with the pine tree, with Peter, and how Peter, after bragging and saying, Jesus, if everybody else denies you, I won't. And yet I want to read one more scripture to you. It's Luke chapter 22, verse 61 and 62. Remember I said Peter had this high opinion of himself. At that moment the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Peter remembered that the Lord had said, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny me 3 times. You will deny 3 times that you even know me. And Peter left the courtyard, weeping bitterly. You see what happened there? God is going to work in your life. If you've got something there, pride, ego, condescending attitude, whatever it is, before he can really use you, he's going to have to humble you. That humbled Peter. It broke him. He went out and wept bitterly. It was the most sorrowful experience he ever went through. And it hurt him, and it cut him deep. And you know what that's like, most of you. You know what it's like to think, if only I'd been a little stronger. If only I'd not been there with those people. If only I had thought through it a little more before I said it. But now it's too late. Y'all know the kind of stuff we were talking about. Peter was broken by that, though. He was wounded, but he eventually healed. And when he healed, he carried the scars the rest of his life, but he also carried the gifts that he received because he was broken. He also carried the lessons. And as God cut away his pride and all of his self-confidence, what was left after God finished that business is a much purer-minded Peter. A Peter who no longer had limbs that didn't need to be there, just getting in the way. They'd been chopped off. A Peter who was no longer boasting and talking big as if he was going to do things he really wasn't. No, that was cut off. I had a similar experience. It was almost exactly 2 years ago. This Sunday, I would guess. 2 years ago, when I received the biggest, hardest blow of my whole life that doubled me over and kept me doubled over for months. And what happened was this. You got to understand what led up to it. I've been a preacher, really a preacher since I was 16. I've been a pastor since I was 24. I was 44. It was my 20th anniversary. And I'd had a good ministry. And I had a good reputation. And things had gone well. And church had always been a place where I was affirmed and encouraged and lifted up, built up. And yet, long about 2011 or 12, I started realizing there was a serious problem in my soul. I began to discover something about myself that I guess earlier I just wasn't mature enough to recognize. I began to recognize that my ego played a much bigger role in my ministry than I ever dreamed. And I came to realize how dependent I had become on human approval. Oh, that was the best sermon I've ever heard. Oh, You're just amazing. How you listen to God and how He tells you these things. It's just so wonderful. That feels good. Especially when you grew up like I did, feeling bad about myself most of the time. It felt good. It felt good for something to go well and discover I can do something. I can do something pretty well after all. And people appreciate it. But God began to show me that I had right motives, but also had wrong motives. Yes, I wanted to see people come to Christ. Yes, I wanted to help heal hurting people and all that. But I also, the strokes kept me going. The bragging on me, I got used to. And I realized I'm hooked on this. And so, about 2012, 13, I began to pray and say, God, you've identified a serious problem in me. I admit it. I can't hide it. I don't want to hide it. But there's something wrong in me. My motives are not all pure, God. I need you to take away these limbs that don't need to be there. And I don't know how you're going to do it. I don't know what it would take for you to fix this in my head, because it's not like I can just look in the mirror and say, Lance, stop giving a hoot what anybody thinks. That wouldn't work for me. But God knew what would work. And I found myself 2 years ago getting the exact opposite of what I'd always been accustomed to. Not affirmation, but rejection from a church. And rather than people bragging on me, lots of people were saying terrible things about me. And they were saying them to everybody who'd listen. And they were saying it on Facebook. And there I was. This preacher who'd come to depend so heavily on human affirmation. You know what it did? It took this part of me and broke it. Threw it on the ground. And it was a painful surgery. Because the first time in my life, I was not getting what I thought I couldn't live without. That affirmation, that approval. And I'll tell you, one reason I waited so long to tell you this story is I had to wait until it was long since resolved. Long since resolved. But the first few months after that, after I left that church here in Mena and Christ Community Fellowship started, I was living in two worlds. I had two big things going on in my life. Number one, this Christ Community Fellowship thing was amazing, miraculous, awesome. The people, many of you, were there then. And the Spirit was as sweet as honey, and still is. And there was so much to be thankful for, and yet at the very same time, I was dying inside. I went into a deep depression, and there were a few Sundays when I didn't know how I was going to get up and preach. And it wasn't because anybody doing anything wrong. It was because God was doing a major work in me. And when God is working on you through pain, it seems like it lasts forever, you know. But slowly, after a few months, that terrible pain began to just disappear. And it's like I came alive again. And when I came alive again, it was almost like waking up from an operation. And I discovered I was different. Things had changed. God had cut away things that I could have never gotten rid of on my own. And I can't tell you that today I'm completely oblivious to what anybody thinks or says. There's still some of that there. But my goodness, it's 5% of what was there. I'm a very different person. And I'm also a much more joyful person. I've got joy like I never knew was possible for a human to have. And I've got a love for people, for every one of you in this room, that I didn't have for anybody really 5 years ago. Oh, I thought I loved them, but it's only when you get the real thing that you realize what you had wasn't so real after all. And I've also finally got a hold of this thing I heard about in a little Sunday school song when I was 5 years old. I've got the peace that passes understanding down in my heart. And I'm saying that in order for God to make you what you can be, to put you where you need to be, operating the way you're capable of operating, He has to do an operation on you. I did it on the tree. God did it on Peter. He did it on me. He'll do it on you. That's why this sermon is called Holy Humiliation. When God hits you with a dose of humiliation, it feels like you're going to die. And you know why? Because you do. Part of you needs to die. But once it does, and once it's buried, and you rise up, you're a new person. And it's the gospel truth.